Welcome. Good evening, and we're glad you're joining us. As always, we are live. It is 7 o'clock on the dot on August 5th, Tuesday night. As always, we have a fresh title, and we are glad that you are able to join us live. If you are joining us live, if you're not, you're watching us after the fact, welcome, and we're glad you took the time to watch the podcast. And as we always give opportunity for folks to ask questions and comments and stuff like that in the chat box. But if you have something and you're watching after the fact, you can feel free to use the comment section, and we will see those come in. And so tonight, the topic title is God's view on wars. I'm a pretty long time reader of different war eras, in specifically having to do with the United States, but I've actually delved a bit further than that and read into other countries and wars that have gone on in other countries. But I was flipping through the news, just trying to see, currently what's happening currently. What are things that are, on topic, things that are people are thinking about, things that people are being told about. And war is just like repeated all over the place. Every time I open the news, there's some new update on a war or something that's going on. Obviously, there are high-profile wars that I think most folks are aware of, if not everybody is aware of. War in between Israel and everybody around Israel, but specifically having to do with conflict in Gaza. The war in Ukraine, obviously, is another one between Russia and Ukraine. But there's also some smaller ones, Sudan, Somalia, which I feel like they're kind of often mentioned in war. There's something always going on there, but these are still high-profile war. Myanmar is in a civil war right now. And I had asked Pastor Ford beforehand, because in my mind, I was thinking, okay, maybe there's like 10, 15 wars going on right now. That was kind of my estimate. So I had asked Pastor Ford ahead of time, how many wars do you think there are going on in the world right now? And he, same thing, when I think he counted up to like 5 or 6 or something like that. And according to ChatGPT, as of August 2024, there are 110 wars going on worldwide. Those range from large conflicts to smaller conflicts, obviously, but they are all armed conflicts between two sides. And so we're not talking about the trade war, we're not talking about the war on drugs, we're talking about armed conflicts with human casualties. And so I actually did a little bit more research than that, and looking into, has war increased? Has war been somewhat on the rise? And, is there more wars today than there was, 10, 15 years ago and 20 years ago? And so I looked it up, and apparently that's actually factual. There are, since 2010, wars have increased drastically. Apparently, there was, I think I can't remember the exact date. I think it was, I want to say 1990. There was 31 major wars going on to 61 today. Major wars. There are actual, basically they're judging these as I think it was 1,000 people per year die for as a direct result of this specific war. In 2024, 160,000 deaths were caused by armed conflicts between two different sides. And so that's a high death toll. It's just, no matter how you look at it, 160,000 people dying is a lot of people to die from one specific cause or a category of cause. And so it just made me think a lot about this issue of war. And I've asked this question before, but okay, what does God think here? When God looks at the earth and he sees all kinds of conflict going on, and the Bible actually says in the end times, wars will increase, and there will be wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation, and so we are, thousands of years ago, God told us that's how things are going to go. This is what's going to happen, and so I'm tossing this out as kind of a conversation starter. I'm really hoping that folks watching can, and I'll kind of repeat some of the questions later on that folks can, chime in. But I'm wondering, what do people think about all the wars that are going on? What's going through your mind? Because we have the human, emotion to deal with when it comes to reading articles, and you see headlines, and you have an emotional response immediately, or you have a very objective and zoomed out response. I'm not a part of it. It's not, this is just what's happening between two countries. Some people are heavily heavily emotionally invested in these wars. They're protesting and they're picketing and they're blaming and you're doing all, the president of the United States needs to stop these wars, as if he can just go in there and stand between them. Oh, you guys knock it off. You knock it off. Stay in your corner. You know what I mean? It's just not reality. But because the human emotion is so invested in it, people just they can't even see that as a fact. And so I'm curious to, from your perspective, and you've been around for some time, and you've seen a lot of this kind of conflict, and you've obviously seen the progression of it. And so from a Christian perspective and a mindset that is looking at God as sovereign, how does God view war? You know what I mean? I'm sure there are some sides that are praying, if not both sides of many of these conflicts, praying for God to come down and help their cause. In whatever God they're praying to, there's this deity needs to help me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, what do you think about all this? Where are we?
Yeah.
Where are we at?
Well, that's the thing I think is interesting. The first thought that jumped into my mind was the idea of the Civil War, because here in America, because how that all came to pass. Well, it's not really worth going into all the details. The bottom line was slavery was the issue. They just didn't, the South didn't want to give up slavery. And Abraham Lincoln wasn't so concerned about abolishing slavery, though he did feel it was wrong. He was more concerned about keeping the Union together. And that, so trying to work that out is what caused the Civil War in some ways. But these are people that are, so number one, the fact that anybody would be willing to fight over keeping humans enslaved, is that says something in itself. But these are Bible believing, Christian professing, on both sides, and both sides praying, for God's favor for their side, and so all of those little pieces I've thrown in there mainly because that is where we're going to find the truth of who God is. God wasn't on either side. He wasn't pleased with the whole scenario. This was not something that was pleased with God. We say, well, how do you know that? Well, King David, wanted to build a house for God, and God said to him, "No, you're not going to build a house for me because you're a man of blood." And what he meant by that is because you're a warrior. I want my house built on peace. So your son Solomon, I'm going to bring peace, and Solomon is going to build the temple during time of peace. And so that's God's desire. God's desire is not for war. He's not for war. But that doesn't mean that war is not a necessity, and that's the other side of this that is so critical. Is many of the wars that we're referring to here, you can question their necessity, but the kind of war, because it's funny. Another thought that came into my mind about this is that people who've never really read the Bible will say, well, God's obviously into war because he started so many wars. But the truth is when you look at it, he never started any of them. He never said, go attack these people. That was never the case. They were attacked first. And in Egypt, the people were enslaved, and God came to deliver the people, and Egypt, the Pharaoh wouldn't let them go. And so that's when he started bringing the plagues. Right. And then once they were finally let go, Pharaoh said, okay, you can go, take your kids, take your livestock, take your possessions, go. And then they went, and then they rethought it and thought, this is a stupid idea. We need to go capture these people and bring them back. So they declared war, by chasing after the children of Israel. And so now God is involved. Because they've declared war against God, basically, because God was the one who wanted them to go into the wilderness. And so when you read the Old Testament, you don't see it. I don't see it, and you won't see it if you're familiar. When you become familiar with the Old Testament, you won't see God as starting fights everywhere. He will challenge the status quo, And if the status quo decides that this is worth going to war over, then he will go to war. But that's not his aim. His aim is not to cause war. And even though there are names in the Bible, God is a God of war and these kinds of things. It's more from the standpoint of God doesn't back down from a fight.
Hmm.
If you want to challenge him, like what's going to happen in the even in Armageddon. Armageddon is a declaration of war by the devil, not God. And in that declaration of war, God comes and just that's it. Annihilates them in a very short period of time. And so I think it's important to understand when we're talking about war, you have to really define what it is we're talking about when we ask God's position on it. Because if it's just little, spats between countries, he's not into it. It's not something that he gets involved in. Even Jesus, guy came to Jesus, and this is a smaller scale war, and he says, "Tell my brother to split my inheritance with the inheritance with me," which is legally a valid question, a valid claim, valid desire. And Jesus said, I'm not into that. He said, I didn't come here for that. And so the idea of engaging in war is not something that God is into, but it's not from the standpoint of I just give peace a chance. It's not that kind of a thing, as much as God will respond when provoked, but he won't go cause trouble.
So you mentioned and I think it's important to bring this up because God actually gives reason for this, but there's there of course the mind tends toward, well, what about the land of Canaan? So God tells them to go into Canaan, utterly drive out these nations, and they do end up fighting these wars.
Yeah.
And so how does that work into what you just said?
Well, when you're seeing things like that in the Bible, and it's important, that's why it's important to really know the Bible well, because you see that, you don't want to soundbite that. You don't want to isolate it, take it out, and put it to one side. Because part of them going into the promised land wasn't with the idea of kicking them out. It was with the idea of how to explain it. The God was giving it to them as an inheritance because it didn't belong to anybody. It all belongs to God. And he was giving it to them as an inheritance. And so those people, when the children of God came along, they had a choice. And this goes, you see this in Deuteronomy, is there's provision that's made for the stranger, who desires to dwell among you. And so when they're coming in and it talks about driving out the inhabitants, it's talking about those who oppose you. That's the idea. Because those who say, no, we don't want to fight, let's make peace and we'll join with you. There was provision made for that, in the Levitical law. So God preparing them for when they went into the promised land. That when you go in, there'll be strangers, there'll be people that are there, and be nice to them and embrace them because you were strangers, and so that whole idea of God telling them to go in and drive out the inhabitants as if these are all just these peace-loving people who are not doing anything wrong to anybody, and you just go in there and take over because I gave it to you. That's when you see it play out. That's not what happens.
Yeah, it's funny actually you mentioned that.
It's important to see the blow by blow
Yeah.
Of how it plays out, because drive out the inhabitants. You never see them going in with the idea of okay, we're on this side of the Jordan, we're going to cross the Jordan, and then we're going to attack. That's not the idea. The idea is they're going to go into their inheritance. They're going to go to these various places. They're going to find these places, and they're going to develop them. They're not developed places, but there is opposition, against that. You're not going to come in here and do that, and so you could argue whether or not God has the right to do something, but that's kind of a stupid argument, because God having the right to do something is as if he was, accountable to us.
So what about so he talks about this idea of Moses is writing, and he actually God says to the people, don't say in your heart, I'm giving you this land because of your righteousness.
Yeah.
And he's to possess the land, but he says,
Yeah.
rather driving out these nations before you because of their wickedness.
Yes.
And so, what part does how do you grasp when you, like I said, the emotional element of looking at war, right? The oh, that's just so mean, that's
Yeah.
wrong,
Yeah.
and obviously there's some application there when you look at commonly looking at conflicts between people, but because there is a lot of selfish ambition driving a lot of
Yeah.
war. But at the same time, when you look at God and it comes to the issue of war, how do you wrap your head around judgment? So
Well,
this idea here that
that's
he's
what you're
talking
talking about. That is what we're talking about. That driving out of the inhabitants is talking about in the context of judgment.
Yeah,
Is that these are people that had, but it's not. It's like I said. You have to really. It's really really important to read the Bible. I have had conversations recently, many conversations recently with people, and I tell them, listen, if you've never read the Bible, you don't have a clue what you're talking about. That's all there is to it. You've got these ideas. You may have gone to church all your life. You may have been involved in religion all your life, but you have no idea what you're talking about when it comes to the reality of who God is, what God does, and how God functions. If you're not, well versed in the scriptures, because you will only see snapshots of God, and you'll think that's all He is. He's just those things, but so the idea of judgment for these inhabitants, and you say, well, so he's using the children of Israel to judge the inhabitants of these nations. Well, what you're talking about and what you're referring to is you're referring to the children of Israel not having their own land. So you're talking about people who don't have their own land yet. And he's saying you can go here, you can go there, you can do this, you can do that. Oh, isn't that isn't that a bit unfair? Well, what about when they get their land? They get their land, they've established themselves, they're there, and then they start being wicked. What does God do? Okay, you can't have it either. Off you go.
yeah,
And they're taken away into Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar comes and takes Jerusalem, takes Israel. And that's happened again and again and again over the years. Is Israel's been taken over, by other nations because they are not good stewards, just like the previous inhabitants.
yeah,
And that's the thing I think that's important to understand is from that perspective is that God wasn't playing favorites by giving the children of Israel land that belonged to other people. He was giving the children of Israel land that belonged to wicked people, just like He would give their land to people because they became wicked people. So it wasn't that kind of a thing, where He's just playing favorites.
So there's a interesting because when you said this, it reminded me of this scripture, and I thought about it, I didn't put it down in the notes, but when by the way, I don't have a whole list of correct questions. We're doing this kind of like we did last week, to just kind of converse and see where this ends up. But I do have some aim, by the way. This isn't just a free for all. But there's the interesting story. So God, working back on the same story, God tells the children of Israel, you're going to go in, you're going to drive out the inhabitants of the land. And then they are about to go in to the town of Jericho, which is the first place they're going to come and drive out the inhabitants. And they don't, like you said, they don't just attack the city, but they begin to walk around the city. The city's holed up. They're not going to give in. But it's funny because right before that happens,
so that's a good point to make, is that idea of Jericho, is that they march around the city and the walls fall, and then they go in and take the city. And it's like, yeah, see, there you go. I mean, God's just helping them destroy some. Well, when they saw them marching around the city, they should have been thinking about doing something.
Yeah, and they were afraid.
They
were clearly
they were
knew
afraid.
They knew it was going to happen.
Yeah, they were afraid, but they just waited to see what would happen.
Yeah.
I mean, that's okay. Well, you waited to see what would happen. It's
Yeah.
like, you can talk about fairness and all that kind of stuff, but it's like, shouldn't you have done something? Shouldn't you have gone out there, talked with them, negotiated, whatever you're going to do? Jesus talks about that idea of going to war. Are you going to, when you're considering going to war against another nation, you sit down and you figure out, do you have what it takes to win? Or do you go and ask for conditions of peace? So that was their obligation. Either you come out and fight, or you know, give us the terms of conditions of peace. But
Mhm.
they did neither.
Yeah, yeah,
And so, which is a whole another idea, but that's, it just shows you that doing nothing is not a good idea when
yeah,
it comes to God's judgment.
yeah.
You're if God's going to get ready to judge you and you just sit down on the ground right where you're at, then you're going to be judged. Simple as that. You got to do something. You either got to fight against him, or you need to come up with conditions of peace.
So right before that uh, initial we'll call it a conflict, they they're getting ready to go in, and then the Bible says that Joshua sees a man standing
Yeah.
before him, and he's got his sword drawn, and so can you try and imagine the picture here? He's geared up for war.
Yeah.
In his mind, we're going to go and fight, and that's what this conflict is going to be. But he sees this man standing there with his sword drawn, and he asks him the question: "Are you for us, or are you for our enemies?"
Yeah.
And then this
Which is a great answer.
yeah he
That's the point that I'm making.
yeah, exactly. It made me think of it when you said that. But he says neither.
Yeah,
He said, "I've
neither.
come as the commander of the Lord's army."
Yeah.
Which is very interesting because God told this group of people to go in and drive out this group of people. Yet here he is standing, totally absent of the whole.
Yeah.
Not absent, but
Yeah,
separate.
Yeah, a third party.
Yeah, a third party, exactly. And so, how does that apply to what happens in the world? How do you how do you scale that? Is probably
Well,
the
that's
right-
always the case when it comes to these kinds of conflicts. Is God's the third party in these conflicts? They're not. Why is God causing this? Why doesn't God do something about this? Those are not questions that should be entertained, because it has nothing to do with whether God caused it or God is not doing something about it. God is there, and He has His army, and he has an expectation of how things are going to play out. And when those things don't play out the way that God expects, then judgment comes.
So, why are wars caused?
Sorry?
Let's just like zoom way out.
Why-
Why do wars exist? Why can't mankind just?
That's the interesting, well, it's an interesting thing. And, I can think of it just from my experience, because I know people like this. And I don't understand them, because I'm not one of them. There are people that, they're bullies. They pick on other people. And I don't really understand that, to be honest. I don't understand that idea of picking on somebody else, because when I was younger, in Tucson, you get really, really drunk and go out and, well, you're going out to these parties, and people are getting really, really drunk at these parties, and they're always very dangerous, because that's what ends up happening is that people start picking fights, but they start them. They get drunk and fight. And there were people that, that's what they did, is they would get drunk with the intention of getting drunk to fight. I was a I was a lover, not a fighter. I was there for the girls. I wasn't there for the fighting. And so I don't understand that, I don't understand that idea, but that's what you're looking at, is the reality of picking fights, is that fights are picked. And by somebody who's the aggressor. There's an aggressor. I don't want to use the word alpha, because it's more than just being an alpha. The aggressor is the better way. Just people who I don't know. I don't really have an answer for why they are that way, but that's the issue, and it can become a national culture. It can drive a nation, or drive a society, to dominate,
Do you
and
think
that
that's-
dominate is somehow meets some, need inside of them for, I don't know what to call it, masculinity, or, sense of, value, being, whatever, I don't know what to call it, but just that kind of thing, that it's that kind of idea.
So, do you think that that's like a caused by one person, or is that like a?
Well, it's I'm always reluctant to say it's a personality trait, because it's more than just a personality trait. I don't think it's that people are born that way. I do think people become that way, and probably more from how they experience life. It's, a lot of things in life are experiential. Why you go in certain directions. There are certain personality issues. There's certain leanings that play into this kind of stuff. But it's just that, because I look at it, the so if you look biblically at the conflict between Israel and the surrounding Arab nations, that went all the way back to an unresolved conflict between Ishmael and Isaac. And when you read it, it's an accident waiting to happen, because it's the God approves. So they make the mistake of Hagar, the Sarah's servant girl, marrying and being a second wife to Abraham. The silly thought in her mind that she would remain a servant, and this would just be a servant's role, and not be a wife role, but he just had a kid and intimacy, and there's a lot of things there that I think about it. I think, what were you thinking? Did you not think this would become something more serious, than just a surrogate childbirth? It's like, what were you thinking? But anyway, so Sarah's like, you better do something about this, and so they kick her out, and God tells him, he says, cast her out, because she wasn't part of the promise. This is your mistake. You blew it, but she needs to go, because Ishmael's not, he's not part of this promise. And so, is it God's fault? Well, it's, I'm not ready to say those kinds of things, because it's silly, to try to place blame, in situations like that. But it's clearly where the conflict began, because Isaac was, legitimately part of the inheritance, because he was actually the firstborn of Abraham, but he wasn't the one, because it was supposed to be the firstborn of Abraham and Sarah. And so, a bit of a technicality, though, considering the circumstances, that Sarah was the one who said, I want this to be, a surrogate son. So the point that I'm making in all that is that, there's enough problem there left hanging to cause a war that goes up to this day, So who are the real God's people? Well, it really depends on whether you want to listen to the Bible or not, and that's a hard pill to swallow. When you read the Bible and you read the story and you see how it played out, and you think, wow, that's kind of cold-blooded. But the Bible says that God took care of, Ishmael and Hagar. He watched over them, took care of them. And so it's like, it's all this back and forth. But my point being in that is that the bottom line is sometimes there's no clear hero or aggressor and victim. There's no, it's not always clear, who that would be, because Gaza, the people of Gaza, the Hamas, through the people of Gaza, literally come in and attack Israel, and in a very, very, aggressive way, and, take hostages, and everything that happens there. And I don't want to get into all the details of it, but it's the kind of thing that makes sense that you would retaliate. It just that is a sensible response. You don't just go, well, I'm not going to do anything because I believe in peace. No, it's because that they did that unprovoked, and so they'll do it again unprovoked if given the opportunity. They're going to do it again, because this wasn't about having so many people. This was about trying to gain an advantage. And so so what do? You just want to become servants of the people of Gaza, because it wouldn't stop there. There was no settling of a score. It wasn't anything like that. And so take that now and extrapolate out that to your hundreds of wars, and that's the kind of stuff that you have going on all the time. Is who is actually has the rights, in this situation.
Yeah.
And it's never 100% clear. And then, because I've talked to people about this, and, do you not think that Israel should have responded when Gaza attacked? It was like, did you think that they should do nothing? And I didn't. My personal experience wasn't people saying, "Oh no, they shouldn't have done anything. They deserved what they got." Nobody ever said that. Yeah, that I talked to. I know there are people that think that way, but nobody ever said that. The issue was, but there comes a point where you have to stop. And so it's like, okay, well, but where do you stop? At what point do you stop? You have to stop at a point to where they can never do that again. And so it's hard to try to find a stop where they won't do that again, because you didn't expect them to do it the first time.
Yeah.
So these are all the dynamics of war. That's really my point, is these are the dynamics of war. And because we don't hear about those other wars, we don't have opinions about them, because we don't, we aren't getting, handed, spoon-fed, exploitive, news, that will get ratings and review and get watchers and viewers. So, when it comes right down to it, it's the world that we live in. That's why when the Bible says there's going to be more wars as we get closer to the return of Jesus, that's the reason why, is because there's just going to be more conflicts, arising. We're closer together. The world is a smaller place. Will anybody be surprised if China decided that they wanted to declare war against the United States after having a 100% tariff or whatever it is now? Would anybody be surprised that they would do that? Because it's affecting them. It's genuinely affecting them. But it's affecting them because they were doing a certain thing that benefited because of how they were doing it, that was taking advantage of the United States. And so now that thing is no longer there that they can take advantage of. And so now that thing they've been banking on isn't there anymore. And so now it's, you've taken away what we took from you. Mm. And so it's like, okay, well, that's wrong. Which is wrong? For you to take it away from us, or for us to take it away from you? Which one's wrong? Or are they both wrong? The answer is obviously not both. So I think what you're really looking at when it comes to a lot of these conflicts is just simply groups of people that can't trust each other. Mm. They don't have the ability to trust each other anymore. And that's, I think, probably what drives a lot of wars, is that you've lost trust. Somebody usually crosses the line, though. There's usually somebody who crosses the line, but at that point when they cross the line, that's when the trust is broken. Like attacking Gaza, or Russia attacking Ukraine. Those kinds of things are but Ukraine was once Russia, so at what point is it no longer Russia,
Yeah.
And so you have all these these things. I know from living in a country like that, Gibraltar and Spain are going to be at war forever, even though they're not fighting, shooting at each other, they're going to be at war forever, because Spain is convinced that Gibraltar belongs to them, and because Gibraltar was taken by England from Spain. And so you're right. But 300 years is a long time. And so is it still yours after 300 years? The whole possession law, to possession being 9/10 of the law, that idea. So so they should just, forget it, or should they keep fighting, and trying to get it back? And if they got it back, what would they do with it? But so that's it. I think a lot of what you're looking at is just, it's conflict. That is what it is. It's conflict. And that's why you have wars. Wars are conflicts. That's what happened to the United States in the Civil War. It was conflict. One side wanted one thing, another side wanted another thing, and neither one was going to live without it. And that's always going to be the case when it comes to war.
It's a relevant question that came in. Would it make sense to think wars exist for the same reason divorce exists? Stubborn people, division in the heart.
I would say that divorce exists for the same reason war exists, but I wouldn't say because it's stubborn people. I wouldn't say it's stubborn. Who's stubborn? Which one is stubborn? You know, the one who's sick of things that are going on, or the one who's constantly doing the things that the other person is sick of. You know, which one's the stubborn one?
Mhm.
You know, and so that's the issue, and obviously there's stubbornness on both sides, but that's the issue, is conflict, and the inability to be able to resolve differences.
Mhm.
And so I would answer the question, you know, yes, but not so, and I wouldn't oversimplify it and just call it stubborn. It's conflict, you know, unresolved conflict.
Mhm. So it's okay. It's kind of this little bit,
Unresolvable.
divorce is a little bit more of like a thing we can it hits a little closer to home for most folks. It's
Yeah.
not, obviously we haven't had a war on the United States soil for a very, very, very long time.
Yeah.
But we have had many conflicts.
I don't know about very, very, very long time, but yeah.
Well, what war has happened here recently?
What has happened here at all? Period.
Yeah,
What are we looking at? 270 years or something like that now.
Yes.
Other nations have been around for 3,000 years.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's
Well,
like,
I'm talking about
we've been around for
in recent
1/10
we'll
of
say
the time.
we'll say modern history alone. You know what I mean? You haven't had a war here for quite a while, so it's
There are buildings that have the date they were built in England that are still standing to this day that are older than America. It's like
That's quite a bit, yeah.
that's not a big thing.
yeah. So, but my point is, unless people have been in the military or lived in a country beforehand where there was, exposure to combat and conflict, armed conflict, or we're talking, street level
Yeah.
wars, which do exist and happen, but
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
but,
I'm not saying there's only one reason, but it is always about conflict.
yeah. So, what is though the why is it that I was going to ask that wrong. What is the thing that drives the human emotion to want to, essentially pick or sympathize with a side, rather than zoom out and think about conflict a little bit more?
Say that again.
So think about what I was talking about in the
Yeah.
beginning, that the human emotion is
Right.
engaged
Yeah,
when
yeah.
you hear about a war, and
Yeah.
let's just talk about some of the reasons why that becomes so, such
Yeah.
an in your face thing. Why does that happen? Why is the human emotion so engaged? Why is it so natural for many people to sympathize with a side and then want to somehow get involved? Just some people go to the real extreme of trying to,
Yeah, I would say that it's because it identifies with something in them already. I think because you see that with sports. You have two sides in a sport, and the ref is a really good ref when he's not calling fouls on your team.
this is going to be a good conversation. I can already tell.
But when but he's calling out all of the fouls on the other team because those dirty dogs deserve it. And then he'll make one call. It's like, no, what's wrong with you? Oh, see, I knew you were for the other team the whole time. And so that good guy all of a sudden becomes a bad guy. With like that, because it triggers on something that's in us. So we already come into the game like this. We're already favoring our own team. And so you come into the event and you're already over here. You're not like this. You're not there to see a good game. If you're a fan, you're hoping, because most games are won or lost on technicalities. Often that makes a difference. I'll never forget the Warriors. What was it? It was a while ago now, 4 or 5 years ago or so. Where the Warriors lost in the championship, but they were ahead. I mean, they were ahead, and the reason why they lost was because of technicalities. And it was like, this sucks. They should have won. And I remember thinking that they've been, somebody behind the scenes is pulling strings here, because there's no reason they shouldn't have won. But That's because I live in California, and the Golden State Warriors are just across the bay.
Yeah.
And so that's not an unusual way to feel. It's like, there's a conspiracy to destroy the winning team, because they've won so much. But that's how we enter into this kind of stuff, is we're slanted, and so that would be my thinking, is that, the reason why we get so emotionally invested in side anything like that is because the thing appeals to us, like slavery. In the South it was like, so in the South it was predominantly cotton, it's funny because I, reading the book, the Team of Rivals, it goes, I mean, it's a 19-hour book, so it's like lots of listening to it. It's got lots of little details in it. And one of the things that kept coming out was the idea of, we need these people to work our fields because Americans aren't going to work those fields. And I thought, oh my God, here we are, 200 years, or not 200, but almost 1920. Yeah, probably over 200 years now. The what do you call it?
Civil War.
The idea, the concept
Oh.
of Americans aren't going to do these crummy jobs.
Oh.
We're still here. We're
Yeah,
still
yeah.
here. We need these people, so fighting over whether or not we should have immigration,
Yeah.
because these people, they do all the menial jobs,
Yeah.
that we're unwilling to do as Americans. And, the Americans are never going to manufacture. They're never going to work at a manufacturing plant. And that's not true. By any stretch of the imagination is that true, because many of those Americans that are working in fast food right now would probably love to work in a manufacturing plant rather than flipping burgers. They'd probably leave that in a heartbeat to be able to go do something a little bit more meaningful. But we're thinking of it from the standpoint of a career. Is it a career to pick cotton? Is that a career? Of course it's not. But it's a thing that, when you're unskilled or poorly skilled, that you might find desirable. But I just think it's interesting, the argument. But cotton was being grown predominantly in the South, and so that's why it was a thing. Because you had the cheap labor, basically, is what it came down to, is you had cheap labor in slavery. It wasn't so much having slaves as much as cheap labor. And, it's mixed in, there was racism and that kind of stuff, but it was predominantly just wanting to keep them oppressed. That's not the word that would be used, but that is what it is, because they want cheap labor.
Yeah.
You start giving them rights, and then they're not going to be cheap labor left anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to go somewhere else for cheap labor, and so
Yeah.
we need to be able to keep our slaves.
Yeah, that's where that whole cotton is king
Yeah.
phrase came from.
Yeah.
And that was actually their big appeal. The driving this more down to like an individual level. So, why? Well, no, I'll zoom back out. So you're thinking about like, comparing it to sports and stuff like that. It's hard though, because in sports you're a fan.
Yeah.
Right. But
Yeah.
when a war is happening, we keep.
Well,
we keep
you're
going back
already
to-
you're a fan of all kinds of things.
right. Oh, so okay. So what makes what engages the fan side of you in the war in
It
Gaza?
depends on what the thing is.
But, well, think about it though, because I mean, if you
Well,
know the whole
now we're
story-
talking about an area that's very controversial, but
Right.
it's quite real. Is that there is a thing called anti-Semitism. It is a thing. It's not that there's not a thing. There is, and I cannot understand it at all. I mean, I don't agree with skin color and racism, but at least with skin color you have a distinction. Whereas when you're talking about an ethnicity, it's like, what in the world are you referring to here? When you're referring to those Jews, and the idea, and the truth is, you see it in Germany, you see it during Nazi Germany, and it's continued on through time, is that because they're productive. Jewish people are productive, and but not every Jewish person is productive, and it's not like it's across the board. But Jewish people generally are. They're industrious, and so I saw similar sorts of attitudes in England against Pakistanis. It was a similar sort of thing because these Pakistanis would come over and they would take any job. They didn't care what it was. They would take any job just to work. And they would work long hours. They would work weekends. They would work nights. They'd work all nights. Just work, work, work. Pakistanis really, really worked. And it was like, they're taking our jobs, because they had a work ethic, and it was just that they didn't want to work like Pakistanis worked, and so that's why they didn't like them. Is like you're making it so that we have to work hard, because you guys work hard, and so if you're a fan of not working hard, then you're going to jump on the bandwagon of attacking Pakistanis, because they work hard. That's what I'm talking about. Is that idea? So you're a fan of not working hard.
Right.
That's a thing. So that's what I'm talking about. Is you're a fan of these things, and that's what causes wars. Is wars are because you're a fan of a certain thing, and now it's time to do something about it. Like the whole farmer thing in the South Africa, the whole farming issue, the whole white farmers and all this kind of stuff, and stealing our land and doing this and doing that and doing the other thing. These were things that they've cycled in and out. And okay, all right, we're going to allow for white people to have farms, and and now we're not, now we're going to take away all their farms, and so it was. You can't just jump in at some point and be sober about your position, but you can jump in at any time that you want to and join the fight, and you'll have a favorite team in the fight, and it'll be based on certain things. Like not everybody has been a lifelong fan of a football team. That sometimes at some point they become a fan. Something happens, whether they're like winning every season or whatever, and then they go forever not winning a season. But people will remain loyal to them because they were loyal to them in their heyday. They'll be loyal to them outside their heyday. But it's a timing thing. That's the point that I'm making is it's a timing thing. You're jumping in. It's something that appeals to you at the time. And so you're going to jump in and be a part of that.
So let's drive this down a little bit more individually, because the human emotion getting involved and you taking a side always it essentially kind of makes you a part of the conflict, doesn't it?
Well, that's what makes it a war.
Right.
Is people take, when more than a handful of people take part in the conflict, and they take a side, and then it becomes a war because now it's worth fighting over, and it's not. Don't try to put good guy, bad guy in this. This isn't about good guy, bad guy. This is about just rival, and conflict. Because at what point, is it time to retaliate, or to strike? Is going to be. There's going to be different reasons. There's going to be different outlooks on those reasons from different points of view. That. Like for example, some of Israel's preemptive strikes. If you are not excited about, how Israel is handling the Middle East, then it's just another thing, another reason why, I think that Israel is a mess. And so it'll be that kind of a thing. That's how it will play out, is that you already think a certain way and then something agitates that, and it's like, see, this is what I mean, because you're already there. Like I said, it's that idea of being slanted, already having a sort of bias, already having kind of skin in the game already, as it were, in terms of your position on things. You're already like this. You're already feeling like this. I've seen it even in church. It's funny how things like that happen in churches. You'll have a couple of people, 2 or 3 people in church that are they're really not happy about a certain thing that's going on, whatever that certain thing may be. They're not happy about it, and they'll talk about it with each other, and It may not be a big deal, may not be anything that's really that important, and they will decide enough's enough, and then they will take matters into their own hands. And then me as the pastor, I've got to come in and go, what's going on here? Well, this has been happening, and we don't think it should be. And it's like, well, don't you think you should have come and talked to me about it? Or at least try to, see if we can't resolve it rather than, come in guns blazing. And because it's in us, it's just our nature.
So I was thinking about this, you know, more on like the individual level as well, and I was talking about zooming in on that. How does God teach the believer to respond to conflict?
Oh, interesting. That's very interesting. Sorry for yawning. I have my daughter here. This She wore me out.
I left early. I was at your guys' house. I left early.
Yeah, we've been getting in addition to all the other stuff that happened over the last couple of weeks. Like, here we go, and I thought I am not going to prayer meeting, but it's like, yeah, but I'm going to die. Is what's going to happen. But anyway, so the God. So Jesus gave us the example of himself, by willingly going to the cross and being crucified. And if your enemy strike you on the right cheek, offer him the left, or the left cheek, offer him the right, however you want to look at it. He brought these things out, and they're hard sayings, they're difficult sayings, because it's like, well, when are we supposed to do that? When is the time to, offer your cheek, and when's the time to do something about it? It's like, well, this is the thing that you have to bring into the mix of being a Christian. Being a Christian is sometimes you just have to, don't get your pound of flesh. Your team lost on a bad call. Well, sometimes your team just loses. You don't go out and set the city on fire. So
Yeah, I had to learn that as a Raider fan the hard way. Yes. So, okay, tell me more. So that, Paul actually jumps in on this idea later on, and he talks about do not repay anyone evil for evil. What does he mean by that?
Well, the idea is, it's really, it's retribution, isn't it? Somebody does something to you, you want to get even, and so he says you can't. Getting even is not a tactic of dealing with conflict, and that's what Paul's talking about. Is you don't go, getting, digging into your evil bag to find something to counter, somebody else's evil. So I was being in a church with a lot of people my age. We're all young and dumb and doing our things, and some of us have sharp minds, and we like to use other people to sharpen them on, and or keep them sharp, and it becomes a tit for tat. One person says one thing, another person ups the ante a little bit, and the next one comes back with a little bit more. And you're trying to get as close as you can to the point to where if you go any further, you're going to cross the line. And that's the issue, is you have to be careful that you don't cross the line. And that's what Paul's talking about, is the idea of, there's times, somebody does something that they shouldn't do, that they need to be confronted. Jesus talks about that, talks about, going to them and telling them. And then if they don't listen, take more, and going through that conflict resolution, going through a process of conflict resolution. And once that conflict resolution has run its course, well, that's it. That's it. You're done, once it's run its course. And so, evil is when you say, no, I've got to get my pound of flesh. I've got to settle the score. So you're gonna, I remember it was, classic thing, and it's probably happened more than once, of a guy going out and cheating on his wife, and his wife decided she's going to get even with him, and so she goes out, cheats on him, and gets pregnant. And so now what? That's rendering evil for evil. And it usually has bad consequences in it. So So it's not a wise thing to do.
So take it a step further. He says, "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse." What does he mean by that?
Well, see, this is an interesting thing, and it's I've heard it twisted, distorted, and because you'll heap hot coals on them, as if that's the goal. The goal
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
is to make them, so then you get even.
Yeah.
You righteous evenness. But that's not even reality. Because that very rarely happens anyway.
Yeah.
That actual, you know, scenario doesn't ever really transpire where you have been able to be so nice to somebody that they hate you for it. It's not a common thing. We don't our niceness doesn't go there. That's not, nobody will ever be jealous of how nice we are. But the idea is being able to see beyond the conflict, because that really is the issue when it comes right down to it. Like, it's good you did obviously have a you're going somewhere, because isn't that the case with, you look at Gaza and Israel, and it's like, this isn't going to benefit either side.
Yeah,
Ever.
yeah.
It's never going to be a benefit. But if somebody blessed the other side, and the other side just, wow, hey, this is over, we're done. It could be a whole nother ball game. It could turn out to be a real blessing for both.
Yeah.
But somebody has to be the first blesser. But the reality is that in those kinds of conflicts, that the chances of that blessing being taken advantage of are so big that it comes to the other scripture where Jesus says, "Be wise as serpents and gentle as doves."
Yeah.
So being a blessing to somebody isn't necessarily pretending like nothing happened. That's not the idea. The idea is I'm forgiving. I'm going to forgive you for this. I'm going to let this go, and we'll just call it a day. And I tried to do that. So how that works out for me, because it is something that I practice on a regular basis. Is there are times where people, they just get upset, about something, and it's always, a misunderstanding, a jumping to conclusions. And they come all unglued and want to yell and scream and talk about, how, what an idiot you were, how stupid that was, and how you should have never done that, and, what kind of person are you, and blah, 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 all that. And so they've accused, they've said all kinds of stuff, and haven't even taken the time to find out, if any of it's true. And so when things like that happen, I just take it. And then I try to pretend like it never happened, when it's that kind of a thing, accusing things, those kinds of things. I try to act like it never happened. Next time I see them, I'll just, hey, how you doing? And people, I find people like that ebb and flow. There'll be times where they're really, really fine. Everything's fine. Everything's wonderful. And then there'll be times where they'll remember what you did to them, and you'll have to relive it all over. But it's, if you just remain a blessing, in that regard, you're not gonna curse them. You're not gonna cut relationship with them. It's like, okay, you're not into me today. Okay, fine, I'll stay away from you. Maybe we'll try again tomorrow. But that's what Jesus is talking about. Being able to be a blessing to people is give them the opportunity to be able to bow out graciously. Because sometimes those things come out, it's like, what, I was totally wrong about this. My judgment on this was very, very wrong. I've had people do, I was surprised. There was a guy who went to church when we were in San Francisco. The guy went to church, and he told me, he said, he's leaving the church and he's going to go do his own thing and stuff like that. And, telling me, basically, telling me what a terrible pastor I am, and how anemic the church is, and how screwed up it is, and all this kind of stuff. And I tried to explain to him the scenario of what was happening at the time, that I was fairly new as the pastor at that time, and still trying to work through a lot of pre-existing things. And he said, your church can't fight his way out of a wet paper bag. And that was it. And then he went to Cambodia to pastor a church years later. It wasn't like tons of years, but it was a couple of years, 1 or 2 years later. Sends me an email apologizing. So I'm sorry for how I left and how I acted and the things that I said to you. And I was like, yeah, no problem. I didn't even think, because when he was talking to me and calling me all these names and stuff, I was going, bro, you're right. You're right. I'm not disagreeing with you. This is the case right now. This is how things are. And you're right. I haven't done this and I haven't done that and I haven't done the other thing. There are reasons why I haven't done those things, but you're right. They need to be done. But, I can't just jump in and kick butt and take names. I gotta get my feet on the ground, and so I'm trying to not so much rescue myself from his attack as much as just to tell him, listen, bro, you don't need to attack me. I hear what you're saying. We're on the same side on this, and I'm hoping to work this out. And it was like, yeah, no, screw you. You're a horrible pastor. I don't need to talk about this anymore. You're just a piece of crap. And so he apologized, for all that. He said he was really sorry. I mean, years later.
Yeah.
And so it's like, that's what I look forward to, because I leave the door open,
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, because you're explaining it now, but maybe you can just kind of give word to it. Is what does all this accomplish?
Yeah.
Clearly, this is not something that was, Jesus said one line and then it just moved on to the rest of
just
life.
don't lock the front door.
Yeah.
Just leave the front door unlocked.
Yeah. So this is repeated quite a few times in the New Testament. There's there's this focus on responding this way. Don't repay evil for evil.
Mm-hmm.
To turn the other cheek.
Yeah.
That whole idea is repeated, and then it's like, okay, so are Christians just like Is that just like, okay, well, we're just gonna be a bunch of pushovers?
God can change people. God can change people, and when people change, they're gonna be repentant, and they're gonna want to come to Him. And so, if we're gonna be His people, then we can't get in the way. That's the bottom line. And so, the idea of being a pushover, or a doormat or whatever you want to call it, and the balance between that and being, peacemakers, every person has to figure that out. But the bottom line is, do you really want to get in the way, of God saving people? It's like, it's hard enough to get people saved, by not getting in the way. You literally want to get in the way, and so people, I'd get saved, except, the old line by, Gandhi, I like your Jesus, but I don't like your Christian. Your Christians, and it's like, standing in the way of, and for good reason, because the conflict, the problem is because the church operated in a caste system in India. So there's this caste system in India, which is not right. It's not right to have people in castes, but so there were churches that were for high caste people, and if you came, you weren't allowed to come in if you were low caste, or if you were untouchable or something like that. You weren't allowed to come in. It's like, no. You go to the untouchable church. You go to the low caste church. You can't come to this church. This church is for high caste only. So they honored that idea, and that was what Gandhi couldn't stand. Which, understandably, he was right, but it didn't matter that he was right when those who are supposed to be standing for Christ are wrong. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. So my wife had a conversation with a woman who is she's Palestinian, and so she is obviously, she's thinking about this whole conflict between Israel and God. We keep going back to this, and this was, that wasn't necessarily the point. It's just a good example, because there are a lot of people who are, polarized by the whole conflict. Yeah. And so she is like, she is like, you could call her what's the word? Somebody who protests, an activist. There you go. Yeah. She's a genuine activist, and my wife has a relationship with this woman, and there are obviously two sides to the conflict, but this woman's obviously only seeing the one side. And she's, because for good reason, she's got family there, and so my wife's response to her was very, she realized, there's no way I could try to get her to, hey, you should think about this from both sides. Right. What that would do is it would set her against her. So she said, she actually talked about how she had to be very careful how she, addressed the issue, with this woman who's, expressing all this
Yeah.
opinion and thought on
Yeah.
the whole thing, and she's like, I had to be very neutral because
Yeah.
it would totally ruin our relationship
Yeah.
if I just started trying. No,
Yeah.
think about this objectively, zoom out what they did, and this.
Yeah, because
this-
people get invested in it. It was the same thing with COVID. I sat across from a person who was a Christian, and my stand on vaccination was this is this is for the benefit of people. This is going to help other people. They're not trying to kill us. The whole idea that the United States of America would actually be endorsing a drug to kill its inhabitants is, if you're going to go there, then you really should move, because you're not safe here, because if they are willing to do that, and it came out, what are they going to do the next time to make sure it doesn't come out? It's like so all that kind of stuff. But anyway, my point being is that, the individual I was talking to, and I got vaccinated, and I have nothing wrong with it, and I've had no horrible side effects from it. And it's funny, everybody has side effects from what they knew was going to be a bad decision, because it's inevitable. You're going to tie some effect to cause and effect thing, because you've already decided, okay, well, I'm going to go this way, but I don't trust it. Oh, see, I shouldn't have trusted it. I got a COVID shot, and that's why 10 years later I have this growth on my back of my neck. I know it's from COVID shot. It's like, just whatever, because you've already made up your mind. It doesn't matter, the evidence is anecdotal. It's not even necessary. But this guy, and he's looking at me, and he's practically on the verge of tears, and he says, "You don't know what it's like to lose a loved one because of the COVID vaccination." And I do, and this person, is so good, such good health, and blah, 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 and they got the COVID vaccination, and they died, and the doctor said it wasn't from the COVID vaccination, but we know better, and you're hearing this kind of stuff, and it's like, there's nothing you can do because they're invested, they're already invested, they've already signed on, and there's nothing you can say or do that's going to change anything, because there's no getting around that. I even try, from the standpoint of, listen, I don't watch much TV, but the funny thing is anytime I'm in a restaurant and the volume is on, the TV's up, it never fails that one of those medication advertisements come on, and they basically say, if you don't die, you're going to have permanent diarrhea. It's always.
And I knew exactly where you were going with that too.
It's always,
Yes, it's so
for
common.
every drug.
Common side effect, death.
Yeah, for every,
Yeah.
if you feel like you're dying, go see your doctor.
Yeah.
And stop taking this product immediately. It's like they're all like that. They all are. And you could, it's just a disclaimer. It's not just a disclaimer. People die from them, because people die from stuff. It's a really weird thing, but people die from stuff. It's amazing.
Yes.
Not everybody dies from the same stuff. And so, but anyway, so you get invested like that, and there's no getting out of it. It's like, yeah. So I can appreciate that thinking, but that's the kind of stuff that wars are made of.
So in conclusion,
as Christians,
from the beginning of our conversation, there's been a bit of a theme all the way to right now. When you have this conflict, which is honestly a big part of the argument, I'm totally winding down here, but you have this huge conflict that a lot of people use to associate God as some kind of God of war.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of Christians even believe that.
Yeah.
But again, we see the scenario play out. God's told them to go in. There's going to be judgment for these people.
Yeah.
God even tells Israel, "You guys are a stiff-necked people. This is not a reward for you.
Yes.
I'm sticking to my covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob."
Yeah.
And then he says, and then he comes down in the form of a man,
dies on the cross.
and tells them, well, no, before that, he said he stands before, which side are you on?
Right.
Neither. I'm separate.
Oh, you're talking about Joshua.
Joshua, yeah.
Okay.
So this is the thing that people use to associate God with war, right? And God shows, no, I'm separate from this.
Yeah.
My army's separate from this.
Yeah.
And Jesus is in the middle of conflict. There's conflict. People don't like his teachings, and it's interesting because he actually says, "My kingdom isn't of this earth. If it was, don't you think
Yeah.
I could call I could end this whole thing right now."
Well, no, he does. No, don't put those together that way because it's not. If it was, he says, "Don't you know I can?"
Oh yeah. No.
Yeah,
I'm
so
talking
it's
about- when
not.
he's talking
It's
to
not.
Pilate,
I can't
two
do this,
separate-
but if it was my kingdom, then I could do it. No, he can.
Yeah,
do it.
yeah. So, but he doesn't.
Yeah.
Is the
No,
point? Yeah.
no.
So wait, there was two different
Yeah.
conversations. I just kind of mixed those two
Yeah.
together. But then we have what Jesus said while he was teaching his disciples, and then again repeated by Paul. And I'll just read this specific verse because it kind of sums the whole thing up. Do not repay evil for evil. Carefully consider what is right in the eyes of everybody.
Yeah.
If it is possible on your part at all, live at peace with everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there is, from God's perspective and from the Christian's perspective, there's always the goal to be separate from the conflict.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is God's view on war,
Yeah.
essentially, right?
Yes. Get out of the conflict. Yeah. Get out of the conflict if at all possible.
Very cool. All right.
All righty.
That's it for tonight. Thanks for joining. And we will be here again next week. We do have our midweek service. We really do encourage you to come be a part of that. Join a service. Check out a service. I genuinely mean that. And we're glad you're joining tonight. If you're joining for the first time, welcome. We do this every Tuesday night. We'd love for you to join us again next week. We have a topic every week. It's always open forum. And so if you have questions to ask, either during the live session or even after the fact, you can use the comment section for that. And we will see those come in. We get alerts for that kind of stuff. And so we hope you can join us again next week, and we hope you have a good night.